We are going live from the Palace Theater in the Wisconsin Dells. Hi, I'm Mike from the See You on the Other Side podcast, and we are here with the coolest weirdo we know, the man with the weird lectures, John Tenney, all the way from Michigan. John, how you doing today?
I'm great. It's good to be here in Wisconsin.
Right.
I haven't come to Wisconsin just randomly in probably 15 years.
Okay. So welcome, as the duly elected representative of Wisconsin, of Weird Wisconsin, I have to say welcome. And I was wondering, what's your favorite paranormal story about Wisconsin?
My favorite is the one that I talk about at my lectures all the time, which is Joe Simonton, the pancakes from outer space, which happened in Eagle River, 160 miles north of here.
Okay.
Old chicken farmer thought he saw a UFO. Was contacted telepathically by some aliens that were in the UFO.
Of course.
Yes.
As you do.
They gave him a big silver jug, and they told him they needed water out of his well. So he did that. And when he went back to their spacecraft, he looked inside, and they were making pancakes. And so he asked if he could have a pancake. They gave him a pancake. And then they flew away. He told his friend about it, who was a judge, a local judge. The judge called the Air Force. The Air Force sent people out. There was a huge scorch mark in front of his house and a giant ring in the grass. And he told him his story, and he gave them, the Air Force, a pancake to do chemical analysis on.
So he
still had it. He tasted it. He said it tasted like garbage. It tasted like cardboard.
Right. Well, aliens can fly through space, but they can't make pancakes to save their gosh damn lives.
So the Air Force does their chemical analysis, and it comes back that the pancakes are pancakes. The ingredients are pancakes. The only thing that the Air Force found interesting about them was they lacked any sodium. They were completely null of sodium. And so when you take into account, Joe's story when he first saw the little men in the ship, they were kind of shorter men with black suits and silver piping and these weird little hats. When you match Joe's alien story up with the fairy tales of the 14th and 15th century of little people with black and silver clothing who drink pure river water out of silver vessels and who can be destroyed by salt, his story lines up with the folk tales of fairy folk.
Oh, okay.
So that's my favorite Wisconsin story. Did he see aliens or did he see fairy folk?
Fairies. That's perfect. John, I think, speaking of fairies, my sister has a question for you up next.
Hey, John.
Hey.
So I warned you ahead of time that I like talking about fairies almost nonstop. So I know, of course, and we've talked about it at length, that you've had your own experience with an elf, as you described it.
Yes.
Can you maybe recap a little bit for the people who are watching and give us any updates on your experience with the elf?
Yeah, so a gentleman a few years ago contacted me and wanted to know if I wanted to see an elf. And I tell people all the time, if someone asks you to do something weird and it's safe, say yes. That's how you get. That's how you get weird experiences.
Always say yes.
And so he sent me a list of all of these things I had to do. For 3 days before, I had to talk to an animal for 3 times a day for 3 days. I had to talk to a plant for 3 times a day for 3 days. I couldn't eat any meat, which is fine. I'm already vegan. But I had to. There were all these constraints and things I had to do. Very strange.
Like, weren't there like left turns or right turns
Yeah,
or something like that?
I had to keep track of how many left turns I made every day for 3 days, and then at the end of each day, I had to do 3 right turns for every left turn I had made. So I would find myself just in the middle of the night before I went to sleep, like spinning around in circles wildly.
So you just did a whirling dervish kind of thing, which is
which is
way
another
to alter
kind,
your consciousness.
And it's very ritualistic. Like,
yes, absolutely.
I realized after the events of doing all this that it was very ritualistic, and I was kind of being initiated into something. So I did everything he said. I went out to his house. It was winter in Michigan. His backstory was he had moved up into Michigan after his wife died. And he would walk through the woods and sing. And he became friends with these creatures in the woods that he calls elves. They talk to him telepathically. And so then I'm out there with him standing in the snow, and he's singing. And I had to stand there with my mouth open so they could smell my breath, so they knew I wouldn't eat them. And I've done a lot of weird stuff in my life, but like these are the moments where you're like, is this where someone in a Keebler elf costume jumps out and stabs me in the chest?
These are the moments you're like, where have I gone wrong?
Right. I've made some weird life choices. And so then I started to see at a certain point fireflies, except the fireflies that you normally see are kind of that lemony green yellow. Right. And these were pinks and purples, and they were kind of popping in and out, not the way a firefly.
Blue?
And blue.
Some blue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I realized it was cold and there shouldn't be fireflies.
Yes.
And then in the darkness and ahead of me, I could hear something scurrying around. I thought it was a squirrel, but I was there to see an elf, so I'm thinking, oh, maybe this is the elf. And he said they're coming. And then at a certain point, I had a camera hanging around my neck. I said, can I flash my light because I didn't have any kind of flashlight with me. And he said, yeah, go ahead. So I pressed the button on my camera and my flash went off, and in front of me, probably 20 feet away from me, standing on a log, was a little creature about 11 inches tall. It was.
You made a sketch of him for me.
I did.
Yeah.
It was hooved. It had big kind of floppy ears and a cat face and a big fat belly.
Yeah.
And little arms. And as soon as my flash went off, it kind of jumped back into the darkness, and I ran forward toward it. And there were little hoof prints in the snow, but it was gone.
Oh, that is excellent.
It's so strange.
But didn't he follow you home?
Yeah. So then something started happening after that where all of these coincidences, synchronicities, all of these things, the universe started lining up in front of me to a point where the first lecture I had after seeing that, I pulled into the parking lot. I was already late for the lecture. There were no places to park. I saw a car pull out.
Because everybody was coming to see you.
I guess. I pulled into the parking spot, and then this giant moving truck pulled in next to me, so I couldn't get out my door. And I'm super frustrated, and I'm like freaking out. And I look over, and the moving truck was from Ed's Lumber and Furniture. So on the side of the truck, in giant letters, it's abbreviated ELF on the side of the truck.
Oh.
So I look out my window, and I'm looking at this giant word elf, and I was like, oh man, it's here. And it was just these experiences where this thing started following me around. It actually, at my house, I always tell people I have a force field over my house to keep out any negative spirits or
anything.
Like
wards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I woke up one morning, and there were shingles all over my front and back lawn. And so I'd pick them all up, and then the next day there's more shingles on my front and back lawn. And so something was on my roof trying
that elf is eating your
roof.
roof.
Was trying to get into my house. And so I talked to some of my friends. Some of them are, witches, and some of them are magicians, and some of them are folklorists. And they said, listen, just if it is this elf and it's some kind of spirit or fairy or something, give it kind of a sacred space inside of your house. Tell it that it can come in, but it's got to behave, but it can have this corner. And so I put out some honey and some oatmeal, and I gave it a little corner, and everything calmed down after that. And I actually started to get kind of good synchronicities and coincidences that were associated with it. But then when I had to start dealing with some health issues with my parents, so I had to have a kind of weird telepathic conversation with the creature and say, like, I can't deal with you right now. I have to deal with my family.
Right.
So I said, can you go back to the gentleman who first introduced me to you? And it kind of went away. Like, it heeded my call, I guess.
Maybe you should reconsider and pull him into service. Just an idea. But so he's gone for now.
For now. And what's interesting is, so the day after I had that conversation with it, I got a phone call from the gentleman, and he said, "Did you send this back to me?" And I said,
"Holy cow!"
The very next day.
Oh
and I said, "I did." And he's like, "It's yours." And I was like, "It's not right now."
Right.
And so
maybe they could help you with the salt situation as well.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's so strange, and it is ongoing. I mean, even talking about it to this extent will fire it up for a little bit. Like, I'll know now for the next couple days that, like, it's still kind of around.
All right.
Like, it doesn't really go.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it can be non-physical.
It kind of emerges a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that fairies are so important to talk about in this time of environmental crisis. So thank you so much.
You know what's interesting, too, is I've done this for 30 years, and I've talked about ghosts and exorcisms and UFOs and pancakes from outer space and all of it. And what was interesting to me is when I took the plunge, it was at Michigan Paracon in Sault Ste. Marie, the first time I told the story in front of a crowd of people. And I was like, I'm going to get up on stage and talk about an elf. And I had all of this trepidation, even though my whole life is talking about weird stuff, right?
Right.
And I got up there and I told this story, and the thing that was so beautiful was how many people came up to me and told me their stories that they've always been afraid to tell. That they will to people. I mean, it's weird in our community that people will talk about
that's
ghosts.
maligned.
They'll talk about ghosts. They'll talk about
Not
UFOs
fairies.
and Bigfoot.
Don't talk about
but I'm not going
fairies.
to talk about fairies. And how many of their stories lined up with mine? You know, a woman came up to me and she said, when I was a little girl, I used to walk around the property, my parents' property, and I used to wear a Walkman, a cassette Walkman. And when I sang, I would see little blue, pink, and purple lightning bugs all the time.
Oh, man.
And so,
Yes.
and so all of a sudden, here's someone singing,
Right.
seeing those lights that I was seeing.
That's intense. Well, thank you. I want to give
Oh,
Lisa a chance
yeah,
for
absolutely.
a question, but I really appreciate that, and we'll have to talk more.
Hello there, I'm Lisa Van Buskirk, your ghost host with the most from Madison, Wisconsin Ghost Walks. And I am so thrilled to see my very old friend, yet not really, John Tenney, because I figured this out a few years ago after I saw you in person.
Mm-hmm.
We're about the same age. We went to neighboring high schools, and our paths, I'm sure, have crossed in interesting places way back when.
Absolutely. I'm sure there have been some punk rock shows in some dimly lit rooms.
Absolutely. Anyway, I'm excited to come back and visit again. Oh my God. Anyway, the one thing that I found very interesting about you, I'm very well read up on my ghosts, a little bit in the UFOs, but the thing that you piqued my interest in was time slips.
Mm-hmm.
Like I guess my favorite story about that of your many is the one about the old lady in the house with the kids looking out the window at the snow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had a client who she said she had little ghost kids in her house. And I went there and spent 2 months researching and couldn't find any ghost kids. She didn't have any grandkids. There were no kids in the neighborhood. She was hearing little kids running around. And I was going to tell her, you know, I have to wrap up the case eventually. And so I was in her family room. She was making me tea. And I saw something on the windows, like a little glimmer. So I breathed on the windows, and they fogged up, and I saw little kid handprints. So I told her, oh, you do have something in this house, right?
Giving me chills.
And she was very happy about it, but then she was like, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't crazy. Thank you. You can be on your way. So about 10 years later, I revisited her case. I went to her house. I knew that she had probably passed away because she was about 80 at the time of the first experience when I met her. And when I got to the house, there was a new family living there, and I walked up and did the hardest thing a ghost hunter has to do, which is cold call a house. And I'm like, I'm not going to kill you. I don't want to scare you, but there was someone here, used to live here, that I knew that thought this house was haunted. And she said, oh, it's not haunted now, and I gave them my business card. And as I was walking back to my car, the woman in the house who lived in the house now, she called me back. She's like, Mr. Tenney, could you come back here? She's like, I don't think I have a ghost in my house, but my children have been drawing this old woman. And she shows me a stack of papers, and the little kids who were living in the house now match the description of my client in the past description of the children that she was experiencing. And the children who live in the house now are experiencing my client in the past. And so it's like, what is a ghost? Like, when we have this idea that we live, we die, and then we become a kind of invisible version of ourselves. But if time isn't in a linear fashion, like if it's all happening at one time, especially with the thing I will sometimes talk about it when I tell that story, is that you have a very old woman and you have very young children. So you have those people who are closest to non-existence, right? Children just coming into the world and this old woman who's just going out. So do those edges of life give you a kind of glimpse into the veil of the unreality of just existence itself?
Yeah, ever since you told me that, well, I heard that story from you and a couple other your very compelling stories about time slips or whatever. I'm like, wow, what if this is all just happening at once? And while you and I are talking right here in this fabulous old theater, there's a bunch of other people seeing a show from way back when right now that we can't see, and they can't see us.
Right, yeah.
And then every now and then someone who's gifted or something may pick up on them.
Well, I talk about this at my lectures sometimes too, which is I have really called for a lot of the time ghost hunters to dive into the history of a haunted location, because I wonder to myself if the original experiences that we think a house is, like if you look through the old diaries and you look through the notes that people kept 100 years ago, they'll say like, I saw a green light that was flashing on the table. Like, were they seeing our equipment in the future?
Yes.
Like, are we somehow the ghosts that we're looking for? You know, if I sit here and I knock on this table and I say to someone like, can you knock like this? 20 years ago, did someone just hear me knock 3 times? And now we have a story that someone was knocking on tables in this building, and it was really just me a second ago.
Yeah, I think you had another story that had something to do with this about, I thought it was the same one, the older lady having kids, and then something about kids seeing an older lady once in a while. Like it was another time slip thing like that.
I have one where my client went into her grandmother's house.
Yes, that was one.
Yeah, she went. Her grandmother had passed away, so she went into grandmother's house to do kind of a last check because they were selling it. And she walked into, like, through an arched doorway into a living room, and she saw 2 little girls and a woman, and she screamed, and they disappeared. So she immediately went home and called her mom and was like, is Grandma's house haunted? And her mom's like, not haunted. She called her aunt, is Grandma's house haunted? It's not haunted. And a couple days went by, and her aunt called her and said, you know, Grandma's house isn't haunted, but when your mom and I were little girls, we were with Grandma in the living room, and this woman came through the arched doorway and disappeared in front of us. And all of a sudden, my client in the present was their ghost in the past.
Yeah, stories like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, again, when you deep dive those ideas, you get into these really complex narratives of reality because, like, so she's seeing a ghost of her mom and her aunt and her grandma in the present. Her grandma is dead. Her mother and aunt are, right?
Right, they're still there.
Right?
Yeah.
Her grandmother and aunt are, or excuse me, her mother and her aunt are still alive, but she's seeing them before she was born.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so they're seeing her, the grandmother in the past is dead in the future,
Yes.
seeing her granddaughter, who her daughter hasn't even gotten married yet, is still just a little girl.
Yes.
So it's so wobbly, like what's reality? That's why I love it so much.
I know, it's like, oh, maybe we're here with a whole nother show going on
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, we're surrounded by
Yeah,
people.
I would hope so.
I would hope so too.
Yes.
Well, John, I gotta thank you very much. We want to make sure you get to your, get to have a little time to unwind before you go up. But that just made me think of your slogan or whatever. What you think is weird is weirder than you think.
Right.
And that's the whole idea. It's like, you're seeing people that aren't even born. Kind of thing. And so the rest of the show is going to be us talking about your show after you're done. Like we're going to do a post game
Cool.
as a discussion, because we've always found your lectures to be extraordinarily thought-provoking in a way that makes me want to talk about it. Like when you see a great movie, the next thing you want to do is talk about it for the next 2 hours and nerd out about what you've seen.
Well, that makes me really happy that you say that.
So
Thank you. It's a very nice compliment.
So, but is there any particular lecture you've done or thing that you think has the greatest reaction, has the most, when you go out and do it, you think it's like your greatest hit?
My lectures, for people who have always seen them, like they are just kind of this mishmash rambling of like what is exploding in my brain at the time.
Sure.
Because there's so much in there and I want to talk about all of it. It is very strange though to watch, like, I will walk around this crowd before I speak and just listen to conversations to hear what people are saying. And if they're really into ghosts, like I probably won't talk so much about ghosts because I want to circumnavigate what they expect, because I want people to think beyond just wanting to hear a ghost story. I want them to challenge their own ideas.
Absolutely.
Even if it makes them uncomfortable, because like we should reach out like that about not just the paranormal, but like the supernatural itself. But I do find that, people do get a little bit excited, even ghost people, when you start to talk about UFOs.
Okay.
Because we do have these stories, and we are afraid sometimes to tell them, whether it's because of the perception of being a weirdo or being ostracized at your job because you don't want people to think you're strange.
Right.
And the reality is if we did talk to each other and we did talk about things as weird as time slips and aliens and fairies, we'd realize everyone has these stories and it's not weird at all.
and we'd all get to enjoy an excellent breakfast of space pancakes. John, good luck with the show tonight. Thanks for your time, and it's always a pleasure to spend a little time with you, and we can't wait to go watch you inside there.
Thanks for having me. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.